Spring 1943. Over Western Europe, the air had a particular clarity at altitude, thin, bright, and indifferent. The bomber streams came on in neat, vulnerable boxes, and above them, the escorts tried to hold a ceiling against the interceptors rising from France and the Low Countries. German pilots had seen American fighters before. They knew the lean geometry of a Spitfire, the quick lines of a Mustang prototype. Then they saw something else climbing toward them, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, with a blunt nose that looked more like an engine mount than an aircraft. From a distance, it did not look elegant. Up close, it looked worse. It was large for a single-seat fighter, heavy in the way a machine is heavy when it has been built to endure. Against the familiar silhouettes of the Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters, designed like knives, this American newcomer seemed almost industrial, a flying piece of scaffolding. Its wings were thick, its fuselage had volume. It climbed with effort, as if dragging a second aircraft behind it. Luftwaffe veterans, men who had learned to read opponents the way sailors read weather, took one look and smiled inside their oxygen masks. They mocked it in the briefest language pilots use when they believe the situation is already decided. Too big, too slow to rise, too late to turn. They were accustomed to punishing mistakes quickly, and the first engagements offered reassurance. When the Americans tried to follow a climbing spiral, the heavy fighter lagged. When they tried to stay with a tight turn, it bled speed and fell behind. The German formation leader would call the move, and the sky would respond like a practice drill: slash through, fire, climb away. And yet, something did not fit the old arithmetic of air combat. Hits that should have ended the matter, cannon strikes that normally tore a fighter apart, did not always produce a falling wreck. The big American aircraft shuddered, trailed smoke, sometimes shed metal like sparks off a grinding wheel, and kept flying. A wing might be holed, a control surface might hang loose. Still, it held together long enough to dive out, to limp home, to refuse the clean conclusion. In the debriefing rooms, the claims were familiar. I had him. I saw him burning. But the numbers began to disagree with the certainty. Too many of these bulky fighters were being reported destroyed, and too many were appearing again in later combats. A German pilot might recognize the same blunt shape a week later, the same thick wings at altitude, and feel an irritation that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with probability. It was not that the new American fighter was winning every encounter. It wasn't. It was that it kept returning from encounters it should not have survived. In air war, survival is information. It means a machine can absorb error, that it can carry its pilot back to learn and adapt, that it can be hit and still remain a threat tomorrow. Laughter still existed. No one wanted to be the first to admit respect, but doubt had entered the cockpit, quiet as frost forming on glass. Because somewhere behind that ungainly silhouette was a purpose the Luftwaffe had not yet measured, and in the months ahead, the very qualities they dismissed as clumsy would begin to feel less like a flaw and more like a warning. The first time the P-47 Thunderbolt went in deep, it did not arrive as a lone experiment. It arrived as a promise glinting above the bomber formations high over occupied Europe, where rail yards and factories lay under a dull haze, and every contrail was a declaration. The American escorts were no longer hovering near the coast. They were pushing inward, farther than German planners liked to admit. Luftwaffe units rose to meet them with habits formed by 2 years of interception. They expected the escorts to be light, nervous, and breakable fighters that could be chased off the bombers with one sharp pass. The sight of the Thunderbolt, broad and solid, did not change the intention. If anything, it reinforced it. A machine that large had to be clumsy. Clumsy machines died quickly. Then the firing began, and the expected collapses did not always follow. German cannon shells struck metal and found not emptiness, but structure. The P-47 shook, staggered, sometimes bled smoke, and still held its line long enough to cover the bomber's retreating arcs. In the logic of air combat, destruction is usually immediate and visible. Here, it was delayed, uncertain, an aircraft that absorbed punishment and denied the clean certainty of a kill. When American pilots broke away, they did not do it the way German pilots expected. They did not try to outturn the interceptors in flat circles. They peeled off vertically, letting gravity do what elegant design could not. The Thunderbolt dropped like a thrown anvil, fast, controlled, and difficult to follow without risking structural failure. In that dive was a lesson. Speed could be manufactured, even when agility could not. In post-flight reports, German pilots chose an unusual vocabulary. They did not speak first of fear. They spoke of surprise, of escorts that refused to be bullied, of targets that did not fall when hit, of Americans who seemed willing to trade beauty for survivability. The tone was not panic. It was irritation, the sense that an old method had met a new material. Losses on both sides were not catastrophic, but they were modest in ways that didn't make sense. German pilots claimed victories that did not match wreckage. American squadrons returned with aircraft that should have been absent from the roster, stitched with holes, carrying stories instead of funerals. The numbers did not scream, they whispered. And so, behind the hangars and the briefing boards, intelligence officers began gathering fragments, gun camera film, pilot recollections, damage patterns, trying to assemble a coherent picture from the sky's confusion. They were not yet asking how to defeat it. First, they needed to answer a quieter question. What, exactly, had the Americans built, and why did it refuse to die? They began appearing back over English fields in shapes that should not have been airborne. A P-47 would come in low, wobbling, its engine coughing uneven power, oil streaking along the fuselage like dark handwriting. Sometimes a wing looked as if it had been chewed panels peeled back, ribs exposed, the clean geometry of flight replaced by raw structure. In a few cockpits, the canopy was crazed with cracks or punched through entirely, leaving the pilot's face wind-burned and fixed, in a stare that did not relax even after the wheels touched ground. On the dispersal strips, the ground crews did not cheer at first. They just walked around the aircraft in silence, touching the torn metal with careful hands, as if confirming that it was real. Engines came back with cylinders damaged, turbo plumbing scarred, propeller blades nicked and bent. The kind of damage that on other fighters meant fire, breakup, and a vacant patch of sky. The Thunderbolt returned anyway, as if its design had been built around a single stubborn principle, not elegance, but endurance. The numbers began to form their own argument. Maintenance officers logged damage patterns and repair times, and what they saw was not luck repeated, but a pattern of survival. At the same time, German victory claims continued to arrive in confident totals, pilots reporting kills with the certainty of gunfire and smoke. Yet when Allied loss lists were compiled, the figures refused to match. Somewhere between the trigger squeeze and the debriefing room, the old certainty was dissolving. What looked like a kill was often a battered machine that would be patched, refueled, and flown again. For American pilots, this changed the psychology of combat. In early escort missions, fear had been a kind of constant companion, an invisible weight inside the harness. Now, something shifted. They began trusting the aircraft more than their instincts. They could take a hit and still bring the bomber formation home. They could dive away with confidence, knowing the airframe could hold together under speed and stress. That trust did not make them reckless, it made them steady. And steadiness, in war, is a form of power. Across the Channel, the erosion of Luftwaffe confidence came not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow recalibration. A pilot who once laughed at the Thunderbolt's bulk now hesitated for half a second before closing in. Another held his fire longer, trying to be sure. A third learned quietly to avoid following that heavy American fighter into a vertical dive where wings could shear and altimeters could spin too fast to read. Reputation is built in small, cumulative moments. The Thunderbolts began to change without announcements, without slogans. It became the aircraft that returned, the aircraft that absorbed punishment, the aircraft that refused to die. And as shock gave way to uneasy reassessment, a deeper question began to press itself into every encounter. If it could survive this much, what else had it been built to do? Before the Thunderbolt became a problem, it was first an insult to a world view. The Luftwaffe entered the war with a fighter philosophy shaped by the hard mathematics of interception. Reach the enemy quickly, climb faster than he can react, strike with precision, and leave before the sky can close around you. In that logic, performance was not vanity. It was survival measured in seconds and meters. German doctrine prized speed, climb, rate, and agility because these traits created choice. A faster fighter chose when to fight. A better climber chose altitude. A more agile aircraft chose angles, turning a moving three-dimensional space into an advantage that could be rehearsed, refined, and repeated. Over Poland, France, and the early campaigns, This approach seemed validated. The fighter was a scalpel, and the enemy was meant to bleed before it caused the fight still resembled the kind of fight they had mastered. At the same time, American tactics was still finding their shape. Escort doctrine was evolving under pressure, and pressure does not allow for elegant learning. Pilots were rotating in and out. Units were absorbing lessons in blood, then rewriting procedures in chalk on briefing boards. Some P-47 formations tried to fight like lighter aircraft, attempting turning engagements where the Thunderbolt had little to offer. Others hung close to bombers and accepted passes they might have avoided if their confidence had been greater. The machine was capable of certain advantages, but the men in it did not yet always know how to demand those advantages from the sky. This was how the Thunderbolt's strengths remained hidden, not because they did not exist, but because they were not yet being used consistently. The aircraft's true power lived in altitude, in speed built through vertical movement, in dives that turned gravity into a weapon. It lived in survivability, an advantage that does not announce itself until after the firing stops. But early combat narratives rarely celebrate what happens after. They celebrate what happens during. A German pilot might see a Thunderbolt fail to climb into his guns and conclude the aircraft was inferior, without noticing that it also refused to break apart when hit. Combat reports reflected this bias. They described what the P-47 could not do. It could not turn a 109 at low altitude, could not climb like a dedicated interceptor, could not dance in close-in maneuvers. Such observations were not wrong. They were incomplete. They were snapshots taken from a single angle, then mistaken for the whole terrain. And when those reports moved upward to squadron commanders, to intelligence desks, to planning rooms, the limitations became the story. Confidence hardened prematurely, not as arrogance shouted aloud, but as a quiet professional certainty. This new American fighter could be handled. It was big, it was heavy, it was survivable, perhaps, but survivability was framed as a consolation prize, something you noticed only when you had already lost the tactical argument. The Luftwaffe had won too many early wars of motion to fear a machine that seemed to violate the sacred principles of fighter combat. But misjudgment in war is rarely punished immediately. It is allowed to mature. It becomes habit, and habit becomes vulnerability. Because while German pilots were building a mental picture of the Thunderbolt as a blunt, limited opponent, the Americans were studying the same encounters and drawing a different conclusion. They were learning where the aircraft belonged in the sky and what kind of fight it could impose. The stage was being prepared not for a dramatic reversal, but for a quiet one, the moment when confidence would meet a tactic it could not anticipate. And somewhere in that narrowing gap between assumption and reality, the next engagements were already forming, unseen, waiting at altitude where the Thunderbolt would finally be allowed to fight as it had been designed to fight. The Thunderbolt did not become formidable by accident. It became formidable through adjustment, through the slow, unglamorous work of engineers and mechanics who treated combat reports the way surgeons treat symptoms. They did not argue with the sky. They listened to it. If the P-47 struggled in one layer of air, then the solution was not to pretend the struggle was acceptable. The solution was to change the machine's relationship with altitude itself. The heart of that relationship was the turbo supercharger system, an idea as powerful as it was temperamental. The R2800 engine could produce immense power, but power at sea level is not power at 25,000 feet. Up high, air thins, engines starve, and performance becomes a slow surrender. The Thunderbolt's answer was to force more air into the engine under pressure, maintaining strength where other aircraft began to fade. But the system was complex. Ducts, intercoolers, wastegates, controls that had to function reliably while vibration, cold, and battle damage tried to tear them apart. In early operations, that complexity sometimes betrayed its promise. Pilots reported erratic boost, sluggish response, and moments when the aircraft felt like it could not decide what it wanted to be, climber or heavyweight. So the system was refined with the persistence of an industrial nation at war. Mechanics learned the weak points and reinforced them. Engineers modified components, improved reliability, adjusted the way the turbo's output was managed. It was not one dramatic fix. It was dozens of small corrections that, together, began to change what the P-47 could do when the air became thin and the sky widened. As those refinements took hold, the Thunderbolt's high-altitude performance began to transform. Up where contrails formed and visibility stretched for miles, the aircraft was no longer merely present, it was capable. It could hold speed. It could retain power. It could climb with more confidence than the early combat reports had suggested. And in that environment, the things the Germans had mocked, the bulk, the weight, the apparent clumsiness, began to look different. The P-47 was not built to flick and twist. It was built to carry momentum like a falling stone. Structural weight, once treated as a liability, became an asset in the vertical plane. In a dive, the Thunderbolt accelerated with a kind of authority that lighter fighters could not always match without risking their airframes. It could convert altitude into speed cleanly, brutally, and then climb back up with enough retained energy to repeat the cycle. This was not dogfighting as a duel of turning circles. This was dogfighting as physics, energy stored, released, and reclaimed. But machinery alone does not change a war. Men have to learn how to use it. And American pilots, who had initially tried to fight the P-47, like a smaller aircraft, began to rewire their instincts. Training shifted away from romantic notions of maneuverability and towards something colder: energy management. Pilots were taught to think in vertical terms, altitude as currency, speed as insurance, turning fights as traps. They practiced attacks that began above the enemy, ended in a high-speed pass, and then climbed away before the response could form. They learned that the Thunderbolt did not need to outturn German fighters. It needed to control the geometry of the engagement, so that turning never became the deciding factor. In the air, these lessons produced a new rhythm. Thunderbolt formations began to fight with discipline, refusing the invitation to low-altitude chaos. They stayed high. They used dives to strike and disengage. They conserved energy the way a skilled boxer conserves stamina, choosing moments rather than chasing them. For German pilots accustomed to pulling opponents into turning contests, this was an irritation. The fight was becoming harder to shape. As pilots grew more confident in the aircraft's strengths, the Thunderbolt's role began to expand. It was still an escort, still a guardian above bomber streams, but its capabilities hinted at something else. A fighter that could dive fast, absorb damage, and carry heavy armament could also attack targets on the ground with punishing effect. The P-47 was evolving beyond the narrow identity of an escort fighter into a more versatile instrument, one that could influence the battlefield below as well as the air war above. This evolution was not smooth. It was contested by limitations, by losses, by the constant pressure of an enemy who adapted in his own way. But gradually, doctrine began to catch up with design. The aircraft had always been what it was meant to be. The difference was that now the men flying it and the commanders directing it were beginning to understand the same truth. And once that understanding took root, the miscalculation on the other side became more dangerous by the day, because the Thunderbolt was no longer trying to prove itself in the Luftwaffe's kind of fight. It was preparing to impose a fight of its own. In the cold logic of aerial combat, most fights are decided in seconds, not by courage, not by slogans, but by what happens in a narrow window when two aircraft cross paths and a pilot has just enough time to press the trigger. The P-47 was designed to make those seconds count, not through finesse, but through concentration. 8 .50 caliber Browning machine guns were mounted in its wings, heavy weapons by fighter standards, and arranged not as ornament but as a deliberate doctrine. Each gun fired a stream of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds at high rate, and together they created a density of fire that turned the air ahead of the aircraft into a moving barrier. It was not one bullet placed perfectly, it was a calculated storm. But firepower alone is waste if it is scattered. What made the Thunderbolt's armament truly different was the way it could be tuned. Ground crews adjusted the guns so their trajectories met at a chosen distance. Convergence, a point in space where separate streams became one concentrated impact. This was not a romantic detail. It was engineering applied to probability. The convergence settings were often optimized for the ranges at which interception and escort combat actually occurred, distances where a pilot could see the shape of the enemy aircraft clearly enough to aim, but not so close that he was forced into a turning duel. For bomber interception, for high-speed passes, for the brief moment when a target flashed through the gun sight, convergence turned 8 guns into a single, violent argument. When the moment came, the effect could be blunt and immediate. A German fighter struck by a concentrated burst did not simply lose speed, it lost structure. Aluminum skin shredded, control surfaces tore, fuel lines ruptured, radiators split. The aircraft might not explode dramatically. War is rarely cinematic in the way people imagine, but it could become unflyable in a heartbeat. The difference between hit and kill narrowed. For Luftwaffe pilots, this represented a shift in the underlying philosophy of gunnery. German training and experience emphasized precision short bursts, carefully aimed, conserving ammunition, and trusting skill. American gunnery, by comparison, leaned toward mass. The belief that volume of fire, properly directed, could compensate for the imperfect conditions of combat vibration, closure speed, fear, and the fact that no pilot's hand is completely steady at 20,000 feet. At first, German pilots often underestimated this. They saw the Thunderbolt as a heavy fighter that could be outturned, outclimbed, and outflown in certain regimes. They assumed that if they could keep their distance, the American pilot would struggle to land decisive shots. They did not fully account for what 8 heavy machine guns tuned to converge could do in a single pass. The results began to surface not as a sudden catastrophe, but as an accumulating pattern. Aircraft that might have survived a glancing hit from lighter armament were now being cut apart when the burst landed in the convergence zone. A pilot who believed he had time to roll away found his aircraft responding sluggishly, then not at all. Another felt the impact not as a single strike, but as a rapid hammering that sounded like gravel poured onto sheet metal until the controls went light and the sky tilted sideways. As effectiveness increased, engagements shortened. The Thunderbolt, used correctly, did not need to remain in a turning contest where its weight became a burden. It could strike, deliver a concentrated burst, and leave. The fight became less like a duel and more like a transaction. Altitude and speed traded for a brief opening, then cashed in with overwhelming fire. And because these engagements were shorter, tactics reshaped themselves around them. Pilots planned attacks to maximize the likelihood of firing in that convergence window. Formations stayed disciplined, choosing positions that allowed a high-speed approach rather than a close-range chase. The aircraft's strengths, dive speed, survivability, firepower began to interlock into a coherent method. War often rewards those who can reduce uncertainty. The P-47 did not remove uncertainty entirely, but it narrowed it. It made it more likely that when an American pilot did everything correctly, held his speed, aimed in the right moment, pressed the trigger, the outcome would be decisive. And as those decisive outcomes grew more common, the Luftwaffe's early assumptions grew more expensive. Because once a fighter is no longer merely surviving but killing efficiently, mockery becomes dangerous. And the Thunderbolt's guns were turning that danger into a measurable trend, one that would soon force German pilots to reconsider not only the aircraft, but the entire geometry of combat it was beginning to impose. The Thunderbolt's real transformation was not written in blueprints alone. It was written in habits, those small, repeated decisions a pilot makes when he sees an enemy shape crossing his canopy. Early on, American pilots had tried to fight the Luftwaffe on German terms, circling into turning contests where the P-47's weight became a penalty. But combat has a way of educating without mercy. The men who returned began to change what they attempted, and what they stopped attempting was just as important as what they learned to do. They abandoned the turning duel, not because it lacked courage, but because it wasted the aircraft they were flying. The P-47 was not built to carve tight circles in thick air. It was built to control energy, altitude, and speed like a stored weapon. American formations began to treat altitude not as scenery, but as capital. They climbed when they could, stayed high when possible, and waited for the moment when the enemy's approach created an opening rather than a trap. From that altitude came a new method that soon dominated P-47 engagements: boom and zoom. The concept was simple and brutally modern. Dive with speed, strike in one pass, then climb away before the enemy could answer. It required discipline, an ability to resist the temptation of pursuit, to accept that the goal was not to chase a damaged aircraft to the ground, but to survive and return to repeat the process. It was less romantic than dogfighting, and more like industrial work, a sequence performed correctly again and again. The Thunderbolt made the method credible because it could dive faster than many of its opponents could safely follow. In a dive, the P-47 behaved like its own physics lesson. The heavy airframe held together under speeds that made lighter fighters tremble. The aircraft accelerated with a thick, inevitable force, compressing time. A German pilot might see it dropping out of the sun and have only a moment to react, roll, brake, climb, before the converging guns turned the space around him into danger. And then, just as quickly, the Thunderbolt would be gone, pulling up, climbing back toward the thin air. To an enemy accustomed to being able to pursue, this was infuriating. The natural response in a fighter is to follow, to keep pressure, to refuse escape. But following a Thunderbolt into a steep climb after a high-speed pass could be a trap. Engines strained, airspeed bled away. The German fighter, so agile in a turning contest, could find itself suddenly slow, exposed, and vulnerable beneath the protective ceiling the Americans were learning to maintain. For German pilots, disengagement became difficult in a new way. Previously, they had relied on their aircraft's climb and maneuverability to exit unfavorable situations. Now they faced an opponent that could decide when the fight began and often decide when it ended. If the Thunderbolt chose to dive away, catching it meant risking structural failure, or giving up altitude the Germans could not easily reclaim. If it chose to climb back up, pursuing meant surrendering the very advantage German doctrine prized until the pursuing aircraft was hanging in the air, nearly stalled, waiting to be punished by the next American pass. Losses began to climb, not always dramatically in any single day, but steadily enough to be noticed in squadron rosters. Veterans were still present, still skilled, still capable of winning individual fights, but the environment was shifting against them. When engagements shorten, chance increases. When a fight is decided in a single high-speed pass, the margin for error narrows. A moment of misjudged closure, a fraction of a second too late to brake, and the outcome is final. Morale absorbed these changes in quiet blows. The Luftwaffe was not a force that panicked easily. It had survived harsher surprises. But pilots began to speak differently. The tone changed from confidence to calculation, from jokes to cautions. They started to describe American escorts not as obstacles, but as a system, formations above and below, dives timed and repeated, attacks that felt coordinated rather than impulsive. The psychological burden was not fear of one aircraft. It was the sense that the sky was becoming managed by the enemy. And innovation, once assumed to be a German advantage, began to tilt. The Americans were learning faster because they could afford to learn. They had aircraft that returned, pilots who survived, and a training pipeline that incorporated lessons without waiting for perfection. Each week of combat produced adjustments, tactical, mechanical, procedural, that accumulated like compound interest. The Thunderbolt, once mocked as blunt and inefficient, was now revealing what it had always been, a machine designed not for a single brilliant duel, but for sustained pressure. German pilots still had skill, they still had courage, but skill and courage are not always enough when the fight itself is being redesigned around you. And as the Luftwaffe searched for ways to restore the old advantage, new tactics, new altitudes, new angles, another truth was already taking shape in the thin air above the bombers. The Thunderbolt had taught the Americans how to fight vertically, and soon the Germans would be forced to answer a question they had avoided for too long. What do you do when the enemy controls the height of the sky? By late 1943 and into 1944, the map of the air war was being redrawn, not by speeches, but by miles. Escort missions began to penetrate deeper than ever past the old psychological boundary where German fighters had once believed the Americans would turn back. The bomber streams pushed toward targets that were no longer peripheral: ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, rail junctions, fuel facilities. The routes cut across the heartland, and the sky above them became a corridor of continual contest. For the Luftwaffe, the response was predictable: intercept more often, commit more units, attack with greater urgency. And in raw numbers, interception rates increased. More contrails climbed from airfields, more formations converged on the bombers. More pilots went up with the familiar expectation that massed attacks would still break the escort screen. But something had changed in the invisible mechanics of success. The Luftwaffe was meeting the enemy more frequently and achieving less. Success rates began to fall not because German pilots forgot how to fly, but because the environment in which they had once been dominant was shrinking. The old advantage climbed quickly, strike and exit was now contested in the very altitude bands where it used to be reliable. The P-47 seconds, working in disciplined formations, began to dominate the mid to high altitude fight, where the air was thin and the margin for error narrower. Here, the Thunderbolt's power held. Its dives were faster, its energy tactics were rehearsed, and its concentrated fire, when it arrived, did not invite prolonged negotiation. The clashes took on a new character. German formations that attempted frontal attacks on bombers found themselves forced to cross through escort fire that was heavier and more coordinated than before. A burst that might once have been survivable at long range became lethal at convergence. A split-second hesitation in formation discipline could open a gap, and into that gap the escorts poured speed and bullets with an efficiency that looked almost impersonal. The sky became less a stage for individual contests and more a system of moving danger zones. When German formations broke sometimes from damage, sometimes from fear, often simply from the cold necessity of survival, the Americans exploited it. A scattered fighter force cannot impose a plan, it can only react. And reaction, in air combat, is what happens when initiative has already been surrendered. The P-47 did not need to win every engagement. It needed to deny the Luftwaffe clean, organized attacks, to turn interceptions into disordered scrambles, where every German pilot was forced to fight alone against an escort screen that still maintained its structure. There was another effect, quieter but more decisive, the attrition of experience. Veteran pilots, men who had flown since 1939 or 1940, men who carried the muscle memory of countless engagements, were being lost faster than they could be replaced. In a fighter force, experience is not just skill, it is judgment, knowing when to commit, when to brake, when to conserve altitude, when a situation is already lost. When those men disappear, doctrine remains on paper, but its living expression fades from the cockpit. The Luftwaffe tried to compensate. It adjusted routes, tactics, and timing. It threw more aircraft into the air, asked more of younger pilots, leaned harder on ground control. But the structural reality of the war had shifted. Germany could not produce experienced fighter pilots at the same pace that the Allies could produce aircraft and train replacements. The Thunderbolt's durability mattered here as much as its guns, because each American pilot who returned was a pilot who became sharper the next time, while each German pilot lost was a library burned. By early 1944, air superiority was beginning to tilt measurably, not in slogans, but in patterns. Bomber formations reaching targets more often, escorts engaging on more favorable terms, German attacks arriving more frequently, but achieving fewer decisive results. The Luftwaffe still fought hard. It still inflicted damage, but it was being forced into a war of exhaustion, precisely the kind of war it could least afford. The turning point did not announce itself with a single battle. It became undeniable in the accumulation of days. In the growing sense, on both sides, that the old assumptions had expired. German pilots had once believed that speed and climb would always grant them control of the engagement. Now they were meeting an opponent that survived, adapted, and returned in greater numbers. And as the air war pressed deeper into Germany's industrial core, a grim question began to form behind every scramble order. If the Luftwaffe could no longer reliably clear the sky above its own homeland, what would remain to protect what lay beneath? At first, the Thunderbolt's purpose seemed narrowly defined: hold altitude above the bombers, break up interceptions, and shepherd the formations home. It was a fighter's job, written in clean lines air to air, sky to sky. But war rarely permits tools to remain single-purpose. It demands that every advantage be pressed until it becomes something else entirely. As the Allied front moved and airfields crept closer to the continent, the P-47 began to change its relationship with the battlefield. Its size and weight, once treated as flaws, became forms of utility. A lighter fighter could dart and turn. The Thunderbolt could endure. It could absorb ground fire that would shred a more delicate aircraft and still keep flying. In the low altitudes over occupied territory, where anti-aircraft guns spoke in sudden bursts and small arms fire rose like invisible rain, durability was not merely comforting, it was operational freedom. The transition to ground attack did not happen as a ceremonial switch, it happened as necessity. Bombers struck factories and fuel plants, but armies moved on roads and railways. Supplies traveled in convoys, ammunition in freight cars, aircraft in dispersal fields that could be repaired if left untouched. The Allies needed aircraft that could patrol, search, strike, and return again and again, turning German logistics into a daily emergency. The Thunderbolt, with its range improving and its tactics maturing, was increasingly chosen for that work. In the dive, it came down with the same authority it had used against fighters. But now, the target was steel on tracks, vehicles in columns, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on grass airstrips. The P-47's armor and rugged construction, the very design choices that had puzzled German pilots, made it well suited to fly low and fast, where every mistake could be punished from the ground. The aircraft could be hit, still hold together, still claw its way back to base with holes in its wings and the smell of burned oil following it like a signature. And then there were the guns. 8 50 caliber machine guns, once aimed at moving aircraft, now turned their concentrated fire on the thin skins of trucks, the exposed engines of locomotives, the fuel trucks lined near revetments, the men caught in open ground. The effect was not theatrical, it was mechanical and horrifyingly precise. A short burst could punch through radiators, ignite fuel, shred tires, splinter wood, cut cables. On railways, strafing could wreck locomotives and set cars burning, forcing repairs that consumed time Germany no longer had. On airfields, it could ruin aircraft before they ever reached the runway, turning valuable machines into twisted scrap without a dogfight ever taking place. For German pilots, this was a new kind of pressure because it widened the battlefield. They no longer encountered the Thunderbolt only where they expected it high above bomber formations. They began encountering it everywhere, over roads, over rail lines, over airfields, over the thin line between front and rear. It was no longer simply an escort fighter that might appear in a specific corridor of sky. It became a presence that could arrive at any hour, in any place where movement occurred. And this created compounding losses. A Luftwaffe unit might lose aircraft in the air, then lose more on the ground when their airfield was strafed. A convoy might be broken and scattered, delaying fuel and ammunition, which then reduced the number of sorties that could be flown, which then weakened the very air defenses meant to protect those convoys. War is often decided by such interlocking effects, one pressure multiplying another, until the system begins to falter. The emotional change in German perception was equally telling. Ridicule is a luxury that belongs to the side that feels safe. When the Thunderbolt began cutting into the everyday machinery of war, transport, fuel, airfields, ridicule thinned into irritation, and irritation into something harder to name. It was not always spoken as fear, because professional soldiers avoid that word. But it appeared in behavior, dispersing aircraft more widely, moving convoys at night, rushing repairs, increasing camouflage, assigning more guns to protect routes that were once considered secure. The Thunderbolt's role expanded beyond expectations because the aircraft itself embodied a principle the Germans had underestimated. The Americans were not building machines for a single brilliant contest. They were building machines to apply pressure continuously, in the air and on the ground, until the enemy's options narrowed into desperation. By now, German pilots who encountered the P-47 were no longer meeting an awkward heavyweight. They were meeting a weapon that could fight above them and punish what lay beneath them. The sky was changing, and so was the meaning of safety. And as the Thunderbolt spread across the battlefield like a moving storm escort above, executioner below Germany faced a grim strategic dilemma. Even if you could still win a dogfight, how do you protect a war effort that is being dismantled one convoy, one rail line, one airfield at a time? There is a moment in every air war when language changes. Not the language of propaganda, but the private language of men who fly and return combat diaries, margin notes, after-action reports written with tired hands. These documents rarely aim for drama. They aim for accuracy, because accuracy is what keeps you alive tomorrow. And by the time the Thunderbolt had become a daily reality, German pilots began recording something they would not have admitted aloud in the spring of 1943: respect. The tone did not shift overnight. It arrived in small, reluctant phrases. Hard to bring down, takes an unusual amount of punishment. Heavier armament than expected. In a profession that prized control and certainty, the Thunderbolt represented a kind of resistance that did not fit cleanly into old categories. A Bf-109 pilot could still outturn it in the right conditions. An FW-190 could still take advantage of moments when the American was low and slow. But those moments were becoming harder to create and harder to exploit decisively. Combat reports began to note survivability with a new seriousness. Pilots described P-47 seconds trailing smoke and still diving away under control. They described bullets and shells striking and producing less effect than experience predicted. Not invincibility, nothing in the sky is invincible, but durability that altered the meaning of a successful attack. A burst that would have guaranteed a kill against earlier opponents now produced only damage, and damage was no longer enough. Damage could be repaired. A pilot could return to fight again. In a long war, returning is a form of victory. Firepower, too, appeared again and again in these accounts, not as a technical detail, but as a lived experience. 8 heavy machine guns concentrated into a convergence zone changed what a single pass could do. German pilots began to describe the danger not as a duel but as an encounter with a wall of fire, an impression born from the density of rounds, the rapidity of impact, the sudden failure of controls. The Thunderbolt did not need prolonged contact. It needed one correct moment, and that meant every meeting carried a risk that could not be negotiated away by skill alone. As this understanding spread, advice shifted from aggression to avoidance. The word avoid is not glamorous, but it is the word that appears when confidence has been tempered by experience. Pilots cautioned each other not to follow the Thunderbolt into dives where the American aircraft could accelerate beyond safe pursuit. They warned against climbing after it too eagerly, where energy would bleed away and the escort ceiling would punish the mistake. They advised choosing engagements carefully, striking only when the Thunderbolt was low or distracted or isolated, because the cost of misjudgment was now higher than the potential reward. This was the true end of underestimation, not when an enemy is acknowledged as dangerous in theory, but when he alters your behavior in practice. By 1944, the P-47 was no longer treated as an ungainly escort fighter that could be brushed aside. It was treated as a persistent threat whose presence narrowed choices. In the air, tactical options began to contract. A German pilot approaching a bomber stream had to account not only for the bomber's guns and the other escorts, but for the Thunderbolt's particular geometry of violence, high speed, one-pass attacks, and the ability to refuse a turning fight on terms that once favored Germany. The narrowing of options in the cockpit reflected a broader narrowing on the map. Strategic pressure intensified as Allied air power tightened around the Reich. Fuel grew scarce. Airfields became vulnerable. Training hours shrank. Replacement pilots arrived with less time in the air, and they entered a sky that demanded more precision than ever. The Thunderbolt did not create these problems alone, but it became one of the instruments that exploited them, an aircraft that could escort, then strike the infrastructure beneath, then return to escort again, repeating the cycle until Germany's margin for adaptation thinned. And with that pressure came a psychological wear that even skilled pilots could not fully resist. In earlier years, Luftwaffe veterans had laughed at large, heavy aircraft because laughter was part of superiority. It signaled that the enemy was predictable, that the sky still belonged to the men who knew how to move in it. But laughter does not survive prolonged contradiction. It fades when the same opponent returns again and again, when the old methods no longer produce reliable results, when the war begins to feel less like a contest of skill and more like a contest of endurance. By the time the Thunderbolt was encountered routinely not just above bombers, but above roads, railways, and airfields, German pilots were no longer laughing at its shape. They were measuring it. They were planning around it. They were warning others about it. Respect, in war, is often a form of mourning for an earlier certainty. And as the diaries and reports accumulated into a grim consensus, one final realization settled over the Luftwaffe. The Thunderbolt was not simply an aircraft to be defeated. It was a symptom of something larger, an Allied air system that could learn, adapt, and replace what it lost. The laughter disappeared because it could no longer do its old job. It could not protect pride from arithmetic. And with the sky over Germany tightening into a hostile ceiling, the question that remained was no longer whether the Thunderbolt deserved respect, but what would happen when respect arrived too late to change the outcome. Underestimation rarely kills by itself. It kills by what it delays. It buys the enemy time, time to learn, time to refine, time to arrive in greater numbers with clearer doctrine and fewer illusions. In the Luftwaffe's case, the initial dismissal of the Thunderbolt was not a single mistake, but a chain of small misreadings that accumulated into something irreversible. By the time respect became common, the costs had already been paid in men. Pilot attrition accelerated in ways that were difficult to reverse, because experienced aviators are not manufactured quickly. A fighter ace is not simply a good shot. He is judgment under pressure, reflex built over hundreds of hours, an instinct for survival that cannot be taught in a classroom. As the air war over Germany intensified, those veterans were asked to fly more often, against escort screens that had matured, with less fuel for training and fewer replacements who could meet the same standard. The result was predictable. The oldest names on the roster began to vanish. And once attrition reaches a certain point, training pipelines begin to collapse, not from incompetence, but from arithmetic. Young pilots were pushed through faster. Flight hours were reduced. Combat exposure arrived before confidence and proficiency could form. A novice, thrown into a sky dominated by energy tactics and concentrated fire, did not merely face an enemy aircraft. He faced an environment designed to punish hesitation and inexperience. The Luftwaffe's greatest early advantage, superior training and combat seasoning, was being consumed faster than it could be replaced. On the American side, air superiority became systemic. It was no longer dependent on a handful of exceptional squadrons or the brilliance of individual pilots. It was built into the structure of operations. The ability to escort bombers deep, to maintain altitude control, to recover damaged aircraft, to rotate units, to incorporate lessons rapidly, and to keep pressure constant. The Thunderbolt was not the whole system, but it fit the system perfectly durable, heavily armed, adaptable, and available in numbers that could sustain a long campaign. Its impact extended beyond dogfights, because the war in the air was never purely about fighters meeting fighters. It was about what fighters enabled. Escorts made strategic bombing possible. Fighters that could also strike the ground made German logistics vulnerable. The Thunderbolt's shift into a ground attack role meant that even when Luftwaffe aircraft avoided direct combat, they could not escape the aircraft's influence. Rail lines, convoys, airfields, and troop movements became targets, and every disruption forced Germany to spend effort on repair rather than production, defense rather than initiative. This is where industrial scale proved decisive. The Luftwaffe could still design fine aircraft, still field capable pilots, still fight with skill. But skill has limits when the enemy can replace losses at a pace you cannot match, and when the enemy's machines are designed to survive long enough to preserve experience. The Thunderbolt's ruggedness mattered not only tactically but strategically, because it reduced the rate at which the Allies lost trained men. Each pilot who returned was a pilot who matured. Each aircraft repaired was an aircraft that re-entered the cycle of pressure. Meanwhile, German air defense weakened irreversibly, not in a single collapse, but through cumulative exhaustion. Fighter units faced dwindling fuel. Maintenance crews struggled under shortages. Airfields came under attack. Radar and command systems were stressed by the frequency of incursions. Every element of defense pilots, machines, infrastructure was forced to fight harder for smaller results. In such conditions, even correct decisions can fail simply because the margin for error has vanished. The misjudgment revealed its price in the most unforgiving currency, the loss of options. Early in the war, the Luftwaffe could choose where to concentrate, when to intercept, how to dictate engagements. Later, it was reacting, scrambling to meet raids, trying to salvage fuel, trying to protect targets that were too many and too dispersed. Underestimation had allowed the enemy to become not merely stronger, but structurally dominant. The Thunderbolt had once been laughed at for its shape, its weight, its seeming lack of grace. But war does not reward grace alone. It rewards what can endure, what can be produced, what can return to fight again tomorrow. The Luftwaffe's mistake was not that it failed to understand a single aircraft, it was that it failed to recognize what that aircraft represented. A different philosophy of victory, one built on survival, concentration, and relentless repetition. And, by the time the price was fully visible, the question was no longer how to defeat the Thunderbolt. It was how to defeat the system that had built it, and the grim answer, forming over Germany's skies, was that there might no longer be enough pilots left to try. When historians speak about aircraft, the temptation is to treat them as personalities, fast, graceful, dangerous machines endowed with human qualities. But the P-47 Thunderbolt is better understood as an argument. It was not simply a fighter. It was a physical expression of how one nation believed wars could be won. The Thunderbolt symbolized an American industrial philosophy, that did not begin with beauty. It began with function under pressure. In a European tradition of fighter design, elegance often meant efficiency, lighter frames, tighter turns, climb rates measured like prayer. In the American approach, embodied by the P-47, strength replaced elegance as the primary virtue. The aircraft was built as if the engineers assumed it would be hit because they understood that in sustained combat, every pilot is eventually hit by something: a bullet, a fragment, a misjudged second. That assumption shaped everything. Survivability was not a footnote. It was central. Armor around the pilot, rugged construction, protection for fuel, redundancy where it could be afforded. These features did more than keep aircraft intact. They kept men alive. And a man who survives does not simply exist. He learns. He returns, with knowledge stored in muscle memory and in quiet instinct. In the long war over Europe, survivability enabled persistence, and persistence created mastery. The Thunderbolt's durability also changed how the air war could be conducted. Fragile machines can achieve spectacular results, but they require constant caution. They demand perfection from pilots who rarely have the luxury of being perfect. A rugged aircraft allows a different kind of tempo. It permits repeated operations. It makes it possible to press deeper, stay longer, and accept the calculated risks that strategic campaigns demand. Over time, that tempo becomes a form of dominance. Not because one aircraft is magical, but because a durable fleet sustains pressure while the enemy bleeds. Firepower completed the logic. 8.50 caliber machine guns did not merely give the P-47 lethality, they gave it probability. In a turning fight, one pilot's skill might decide the outcome. In high-speed engagements, where closure rates were punishing and firing windows brief, concentrated fire compensated for imperfection. It reduced dependence on the single perfect shot. It rewarded correct positioning and disciplined timing rather than artistry alone. A pilot did not need to be a legend to be effective. He needed to be trained, steady, and part of a doctrine that understood how to create that short moment when 8 guns converged into certainty. That is why the P-47's story is not only about combat, it is about systems. War, especially modern war, becomes a contest of industrial structures as much as a contest of individuals. The Thunderbolt was designed to be produced, repaired, and returned to service repeatedly. It fit an American war economy that could manufacture engines, airframes, ammunition, and spare parts on a scale Germany could not match, then send them across an ocean and keep them operating in harsh conditions. The aircraft was not just a weapon. It was a component in a larger machine that converted raw materials into operational pressure. In this kind of war, individual skill does not vanish. It still matters, sometimes decisively, but it yields more and more to structure. The Luftwaffe's early war culture prized the exceptional pilot, the ace, as a symbol and as a tactical force. The Allied air campaign increasingly valued the repeatable sortie, formation discipline, standardized training, predictable logistics, the ability to replace losses without breaking the system. The Thunderbolt belonged to that world. It was not built to create a small number of invincible men. It was built to help an average pilot survive long enough to become dangerous, and to help a large force remain effective even as losses mounted. This is the deeper way modern air warfare was redefined. Control of the sky became less about momentary brilliance and more about sustained capability. Altitude control, energy tactics, escort doctrine, ground attack integration, industrial replacement, these were not separate developments. They were parts of a single transformation, and the P-47 sat at the center of it like a steel keystone. In the end, the Thunderbolt represented a sobering truth. Wars are not always decided by the best duelist. They are often decided by the side that can keep fighting when perfection fails, by the side that builds machines and doctrines that assume human limitation, then design around it. And in that sense, the P-47 was more than an airplane. It was a forecast of the future, a world where victory belonged not to the most graceful aircraft, but to the most enduring system that could keep returning, day after day, until the sky itself changed ownership. Long after the skies over Europe fell quiet, the Thunderbolt remained in memory not as a perfect aircraft, but as a faithful one. In photographs, it still looks large, almost excessive, a fighter built around an engine that seems too big, wings that carry more metal than grace. It does not possess the clean elegance that people often associate with mastery in the air. And yet, for the men who flew it, beauty was never the point. They remembered the feeling of returning of seeing a coastline, a runway, a flare of grass and concrete when they had expected only cold sky. In reunion halls and written memoirs, pilots spoke about the P-47 with a particular tone. Not worship, not nostalgia, but a kind of practical gratitude. They remembered the weight of the aircraft in a dive, the steadiness of its gun platform, the way it could take damage that would have destroyed something more delicate. They remembered how it forgave small errors, and how that forgiveness turned fear into discipline. Reliability, in war, is not comfort. It is survival made repeatable. This was the Thunderbolt's enduring reputation, a machine that brought people home. It did not need to be the fastest in every regime, or the most agile in every fight. It needed to be present where the war demanded presence, high above bomber streams, low over rail lines, anywhere that pressure had to be applied again and again. The P-47 became, almost unintentionally, a kind of bridge between two eras, the age of the duelist and the age of the system. Even German assessments, often written with careful understatement, began to concede its effectiveness, not with praise, because enemies rarely grant that freely, but with the language of recognition. It was hard to kill, dangerous in a dive, heavily armed, capable of imposing a fight that punished mistakes. German pilots did not speak about it as a mystery by the end. They spoke about it as a problem that had been solved too late, one more element in an air campaign that slowly removed Germany's ability to control its own skies. The 8 50 caliber machine guns became a symbol not merely of firepower, but of a shift in warfare's character. They represented concentrated force applied in short, decisive moments, an approach suited to high-speed passes and disciplined formations, where success depended less on the drama of the turning duel and more on the management of energy and timing. In the Thunderbolt's convergence zone, the old romance of air combat met a modern reality. Fights could be decided quickly, impersonally, by a machine designed to make probability favor its pilot. In the years that followed, fighter design carried forward the lesson. Engineers and air forces became less willing to treat survivability as secondary. They placed greater emphasis on systems that preserved the pilot, on firepower that compensated for imperfect conditions, on performance that mattered not only in a test flight, but in a sustained campaign. The P-47 did not single-handedly create that future, but it helped prove the logic behind it, that the most effective weapon is often the one that can endure long enough to be used repeatedly. History records this without judgment, because history rarely needs to moralize. The war was not decided by one aircraft, and the Thunderbolt did not win the skies alone, but it became one of the machines that exposed a deeper truth, that certainty is fragile when it rests on assumptions, and that arrogance, especially in technical war, can be punished by design choices that look unimpressive until they begin to work. The Luftwaffe's early laughter was not foolish in the way people imagine foolishness. It was professional confidence, shaped by years of success, and a doctrine that had once been correct. That is what makes the story instructive. The most dangerous misjudgments are not made by amateurs. They are made by experts who believe the old rules will continue to apply. In the end, the Thunderbolt did not need to win admiration. It needed to keep appearing over bomber streams, over airfields, over roads and railways, until the enemy's freedom of action narrowed into exhaustion. It turned durability into strategy. It turned weight into authority. It turned concentrated fire into a new kind of certainty. And when the war was over, what remained was not the memory of a beautiful shape in the sky, but the memory of a shape that refused to disappear. They laughed at it once. They never laughed again.